Whether the market systems development approach or MSD approach works in practice is a hot topic in development. With me is Maja Rüegg, who is co-leading the working area Sustainable and Inclusive Economies at Helvetas. She provides thematic support on market systems development for projects working on agricultural value chains and labor markets. Her advisory expertise also covers monitoring and evaluation. Previously, Maja worked in rural development projects in Tanzania and Madagascar. She has also done research in Kyrgyzstan and Bolivia on topics related to rural economy. She has worked in development cooperation since 2008. Maja, thank you for being part of this episode.
Thanks a lot, Sabine. It's a pleasure to be here in this great initiative.
With me is also Markus Jenal, who is a partner at the German consultancy Mesopartner, which is a knowledge firm that specializes in economic development, territorial development, competitiveness, and innovation. His work and interests are all about how systems work and how we can influence their evolution. His approach is to stimulate the co-creation of learning strategies and change activities. Previously, Markus worked for different development organizations focusing on Southeast Asia and East Africa, including the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe. Markus, thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me, Sabine.
For those of you who aren't yet familiar with the market systems development approach or the MSD approach, it's a development approach that reduces poverty by enhancing the ways the most vulnerable interact with markets. At the regional program RECONOMY, for example, we apply the MSD approach in order to make the market systems function better to increase the quality of life for people in need through systemic action, our facilitated role, outreach, and sustainable change. For this episode, we've asked people on LinkedIn to post their questions they'd like to ask our guests, whether the MSD approach works in practice and what it takes to shift to a systemic approach. Thank you to all of you who have sent their questions and for contributing to Inclusive Plug. Your participation helps keep the podcast alive. Maja, we have a question from Kristina Stoyanovska, who is professional associate at the Education for Employment in North Macedonia project of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. Her question is how to balance between achieving indicators and achieving systemic change.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot for the question. So for me, what would be really important in that reflection is that actually we try to not have too much contradiction between the indicators we want to achieve and the systemic change that we want to achieve. So maybe if I think from the start of a project, when we come up with a log frame, it's always very important how we set our indicators, right? Everybody knows that. And maybe there are certain pressures to have very much a focus on the impact and outcome level indicators, you know, the final beneficiaries. That's necessary and that's good. However, I think when one takes an MSD approach, really, it is key to also have enough weight on indicators that measure systemic change. So to give an example, if a project works on, among other things, on financial inclusion. So obviously we need indicators like how many people, how many women, how many men have access to quality financial services, right? But also make sure that we have enough indicators that also capture how many financial institutions provide quality services, how did the services improve, which actors crowded into this space of financial inclusion, so that we can also capture what we actually want to achieve on the systemic change level. So I think that would be my most important advice on this question. And in that sense, you know, I think once we capture the systemic change, then we have to be able to tell the story. So how does that lead to the actual outcome and impact that we want to achieve? So also this storytelling element is important. And maybe just the last thought on that question, not to forget about measuring also the indirect effect. I mean, why we use systemic approach has a lot to do with actually achieving systemic change that has an effect not only on direct beneficiaries but also indirect beneficiaries. But then we also have to measure them and tell the story, right? And I'm thinking about my experience with supporting a project in Guatemala. That's a CEDA-funded project in Guatemala that Helvetas implements. And there I was just reflecting a few months ago with the team. They have measured a lot of the impact outcomes and impacts on the level of beneficiaries at the production side, women producing horticulture, potatoes, other value chains as well. But they have not so far so much captured the effects as well in other points of the value chain, like traders, also processors, and the employment effects on that stage. So also I think this measurement effort is key to find this right balance.
We have two questions from Maja Lostova, who is finance manager at the Education for Employment in North Macedonia project of the SDC. Her first question is the MSD approach applicable in every country?
Okay, so question from Maja to Maja. Yes, I think what I would like to emphasize here on this question is I would like to distinguish between the questions that an MSD approach raises and the answers or solutions that an MSD project finds. So in terms of applicability of this approach to a country, I think the questions that the approach raises, I would find them really quite applicable to any country. And I hope I don't sound like, if you're a hammer, everything is a nail. But I think if we think about the questions that the approach raises, like, for example, if you see problems in the market systems, you try to find the causes for these problems, the underlying causes. I think that's a very important element of any kind of good development work, no matter in which country we work. Yeah, so this really going to the causes, working on the causes. Another example of the guiding questions of the approach is to think about the sustainability. So the famous questions of who will do, who will pay in the future. And I think these questions, again, no matter in which country you work, if you try to improve certain functions in a market system, I think it always makes sense to think, okay, what happens after this project intervention? Who will do this function? Who will pay for this function? So this kind of question, I also find it very applicable. However, now when we go to the solutions or the answers, there I think necessarily there needs to be a lot of difference between one country and another. I mean, the country context is so important. And so there is no kind of one size fits all of if you are an MSD project, you always work with, let's say, the lead firm that provides a new service and so on and so forth. No, that's really country dependent. And if I take an example from Kyrgyzstan, an SDC project, BioLi that Helvetas implements in the south of Kyrgyzstan. So the question, so let's say there's a weak entrepreneurship activity, especially amongst women. Now, the question of why this is the case, I think that applies, right? If it's Kyrgyzstan or Bolivia or Mozambique. So then the answer of why this is the case, that can change from one country to the other. In Kyrgyzstan, there's a lot to do with culture, especially also gender perspective of, especially married women, in how far it's culturally accepted, socially accepted to start economic activity. And then the solution can be different, yeah? So in Kyrgyzstan, it's maybe about working more on this culture. Maybe in Mozambique, it's working on training on entrepreneurship skills, right? But then the question about sustainability of who will provide such training in the future, who will pay for such training in the future, again, this is applicable be it to Mozambique or Kyrgyzstan. So that's a bit my thoughts on this question. Hopefully that answers at least part of it.
Maya's second question is, what is the biggest risk in the application of the MSD approach?
Yes, there's many risks, of course, and it's difficult to really pick and choose, what is the biggest risk. I think something that many of us are struggling with is to integrate environmental dimensions to the necessary extent in our MSD projects. And of course, there's many differences and it's difficult to generalize, but I think the MSD approach, it's demanding in terms of skills and in terms of the reflection process and the learning and everything. And so to keep really also transversal dimensions like environmental or also inclusiveness is really an extra effort, and it's so key to do it, but it's also very difficult. So to give you an example, in one project I worked in Tanzania, that's now a while back, it was an SDC project, and I think when the sector selection was done, for economic sector were selected, I think in that sector selection, the environmental criteria were actually not weighed enough. Either they were not there or they didn't have enough weight. I don't remember exactly. But the question, for example, of how will climate change affect, in terms of our prognostics that we have, these sectors, these potential sectors, and how does that influence our choice of sectors? This, I think, was not there in the reflection. And also in terms of the reflection of the environmental dimension in the objectives, I kind of remember that it was not very explicit. And then it's no surprise that in the intervention design that maybe the environmental dimension is then not emphasized enough. Now, I think what is very important to mitigate this risk is really to have the tools, to have the guidelines, the operational guidelines. In Helvetas, we have worked on a guideline how to assess and address climate-related risks in MSD. So, for example, sector selection, taking also the view of climate change is with this guideline, I think, now very much operationalizable. I just yesterday actually also saw that ILO has just produced also a guideline on how to take into account environmental dimension in value chain development MSD. So I think, the more tools there are, the easier we will get to deal with this risk. But yeah, that's just one of the risks. Inclusiveness is another one. I think there was an episode on inclusiveness just recently on this inclusive plaque. So I don't want to repeat, but that would be also very much a focus of where we need to remain attentive.
We have two questions from Dorina Georgieva-Mitrovska, who is project coordinator at the Macedonian Civic Education Center. Her questions are, how do we know that the MSD approach would be the best way to go? And what skills does an MSD team need to have?
Yeah. So on the first question, how do we know if the MSD approach is the right way to go? Maybe I can just highlight two aspects. I think one precondition to work with this approach is a certain commitment to work systemically, because it's not the easiest thing to do, as we know probably. Often it's easier to provide a direct solution, to have more control and so on. So it is an effort, right? And it needs commitment both on the implementer side, but I think very importantly on the donor side, right? Really this question, if the donor has the commitment to work with a systemic approach, is key. That also has to do with timeline then, normally MSD projects, they take some time to really achieve systemic change with the stakeholders, the local stakeholders. So the donor commitment, I mean, of course, we can also work on that, but I won't go now into that. I think maybe others in this podcast can deepen also on this, on how to motivate donors. The other aspect I wanted to highlight on this is about really being clear of who is the target group, the beneficiaries, or at Helvetas we call the group also primary stakeholders. Now, if our target group is a group of very extreme poor households, very marginalized women and men, then we have to think if we can really start off with a very indirect systemic approach. And I think sometimes a bit of a graduation model is also the right way to go, to start off with a bit more direct, but always having a vision of moving to a more indirect systemic approach. Yeah, I think that's it for the first question. The second question that you mentioned is about the skills. And here again, I mean, I could talk for hours about the skills. It's a very fascinating topic, and I think it's so important to be clear about what skills we need in an MSD team. However, I don't want to do all the catalog of skills. There is a tool on the Beam Exchange website, the competency framework. It's fantastic. It's very comprehensive if you want to know more about the skill set. I actually want to just focus maybe on one aspect, and this is the organizational culture. It's something that I supported a capitalization of experience process in Tanzania. To learn from experience, like 10 years experience with MSD. And we found out that really the whole project management skills, and especially this organizational culture was key, for both success and failure. And I would say to really be able to instill an organizational culture that allows, that even encourages learning from failure is very central for this MSD approach. And it's very difficult, right? I mean, it's not natural to us to always talk about, oh, this didn't work, and I failed there, we should have done differently, and so on. But it's really important to experiment, to be able to experiment, and then also have the courage to say, no, we need to try something else, we learned. I think this culture is key, and there's different tactics for that, for example, to have a bit of maybe a positive approach for it. So project manager, if she is a role model, to really kind of also admit failure, I think that's important. From one experienced project manager, I once heard that at the beginning of the project, he institutionalized failure parties. I mean, that's a bit extreme, but I think it can open up horizons and mindsets. I think, well, in team meetings that we lead in our team, we have this slot on oops moments where just ad hoc people can share where things didn't work out and institutionalize a bit this.
We have a question from Denada Kakele, who is Intervention Manager for Skills at the RECI Albania project of the SDC. What are the main challenges when moving from pilot to scale? What are some smart tactics to keep in mind?
Thanks for this question. I had the pleasure to work a few months in RECI Albania, but that's already a bit of back, and I didn't meet Denada at the time, but good to have an interaction in this format. Tactics to move from pilot to scale. Maybe I can mention a few aspects. I think any kind of partnership we engage with in a pilot phase, we need to be very clear with the partner that our ambition doesn't stop there, but we want to go beyond. So, for example, if we work with a trader in, let's say, horticulture, and we work with this partner to kind of have better service provision to the producers of horticulture, to have a certain contracting agreement, to provide also knowledge to the farmers, etc. Right? We can of course work with this one lead firm or trader, but this is not the end of our ambition. We want to transform the sector, to have systemic change. And so I think to be clear with a partner from the start that we will also work with, for example, competitors of this company, and with other stakeholders. I think that's important. It's not easy, but I think it's important to set the mindset. Another tactic is linked to what I said before, to learn also if a pilot does not work. So just also be sure that if we are trying out a solution and we just see that it's not picking up, to have the courage to say, probably it wasn't the right trick, maybe we have to find another partner, or we do something else with the same partner if we see the motivation is there, but actually, the trigger didn't work, So learning also. The third aspect is about finding the right moment to finish the hand-holding, let's say. So, in this adopt, adapt, expand, respond framework that I think most of those who are listening and watching, who are familiar with the MSD approach, they kind of picture it right now. So this AAER framework, if we are in the adopt phase where it's all about piloting, we also need to have this sensitivity to then move to the adapt phase, which means to actually step back, right? And say, we have supported, now we just watch and see if the partner is actually picking up, is maybe institutionalizing the new service, for example, is making adaptations to this service and so on. So to stand back. And at the same time, also having the instinct to reach out to other stakeholders while doing this pilot, to motivate also other stakeholders, including competitors, as I said before, to watch and see, what is happening. And maybe just the last aspect, also to put a bit into perspective that this whole move from pilot to scale, there's also an element of, we cannot control everything and we shouldn't control everything. And it's all about also the stakeholder and the sector dynamics where we are engaged in, right? And I think sometimes we have to really see it as an interdependency. That's a bit abstract, but if I take again the example from Tanzania, I remember, in the sunflower sector, we worked on different entry points in that sector. We worked on seeds, we worked on contract farming, and we tried to work also on access to finance. Now, the contract farming picked up quite well in terms of scale, moving from pilot to scale. The seeds was a bit slower, but when the contract farming picked up, then the traders, the processors, they bought the seeds. So the seed sector also was dynamized. The finance, initially, the financial institutions, they were not interested. They were like, we don't really see the business case and so on. Now, when the contract farming picked up and the seeds were dynamized, all of a sudden the financial institutions, they were interested, to change their financial products or to adapt it more to that sunflower sector business. So, it also plays together when it comes to pilot to scale. And I think it's important to watch these dynamics, if that makes sense.
Marcus, Elvira Moedini, who is project manager of the RECI Albania project of the SDC, she has sent a comment and also a question. Despite being a very good and effective approach, MSD projects also often struggle to scale and make their changes become systemic. Meaning, for example, when they need to be embraced by the local and central government actors, one of the reasons why that happens is that these actors fail to institutionalize the approach. When introduced to it, they do not pay attention. They prefer more quick actions and look for quick wins. Do you think a training in MSD tailored for such government partners could help? And if yes, is there any tailored MSD training for these target groups? Here, I mean more high executives, not technical staff who are anyway part of our MSD trainings. Technical staff trained has shown they're not able to influence the high executives, and they also change more often. So what's your response to this, Marcus?
Yeah, scale is the never-ending question, isn't it? Every MSD project is struggling with that. Well, I think there are at least 3 different situations that come to mind that are relevant for scale, and they are often conflated in MSD. one is the approach to replicate successful models, maybe with other partners or with the same partners in different areas, and ideally by actors that weren't connected to the project before, so they pick it up themselves and they do it as well. That requires that that the solution that wants to go to scale is complicated. It's a fix to a complicated problem. It can be applied repeatedly by different actors, and it yields the same positive result independent of who does it. That means it can be written up, it can be communicated clearly, and of course it will be tailored by each actor who does it. But in general, we should be able to write a step-by-step guide or a standard operating procedure or something like that. So it can be communicated to different actors. An example for this would be the smaller seed packages pioneered by Catalyst in Bangladesh that have become very famous in MSD, and which has been a very well documented case study. So this is an example where a product was introduced. It's quite clear what the product is, how it is done, why it works, and it worked for others as well. So it can be replicated in that way. The second situation is more difficult for MSD projects. It is when they think they found a solution to a problem that can be replicated by others, but actually it's very specific to one particular partner. It is very specifically adapted to that company's way of working, to that company's culture, to that company's history. It's deeply linked to that particular context. And what happens is then that others won't pick it up. And you go like, well, this is a brilliant solution. Why is no one else doing it? This could be because it cannot be well communicated. It is based on tacit knowledge of the staff of that particular company that does it. So others struggle to understand how it even works and why it will work for them. An example here could be that the company started to integrate more women into their workforce, and they found specific ways to accommodate the work-life balance of the women, the time they need to spend on other duties like childcare. So the solution is very specific. It's maybe because of particular people in that company, the boss of that company, and so on. And others just somehow struggle to do that. They cannot just copy the specific arrangements like the contracts or childcare or whatever, because that often fails then in the new context. The third situation is probably the one Lira was alluding to, is when there are too many social, cultural, legal, or economic or other constraints in the way for these solutions to scale. This is the case, for example, when the challenge is that solutions need to be what is often called embraced by government actors, or when the approach needs to be institutionalized. This is probably the most complex case of a problem with getting to scale. And I'm actually not sure if the MSD approach is able to tackle that as such. It is about finding whether there are relevant people with the required influence that are actually interested in these kinds of solutions. And it requires us to work with them and understand what their role is, how they can shift these constraints so this kind of new solutions can actually be adopted by others. This is much more, I guess, about political and social and governance aspects in a country than it is about economic aspects. That is why I'm saying I'm not sure if MSD as an approach itself on its own can tackle this kind of problem. We might need more political economy, we might need more governance types of interventions there. We need to better map the constraints and understand which ones can actually be shifted within the lifetime of a project and which ones cannot. I think many of these constraints that are relevant for these particular scaling issues are very fundamental to the culture, the political economy, and the history of that context, and might take longer to shift.
We have two questions from Anita Alexova, who is policy and governance expert at the Education for Employment in North Macedonia project of the SDC. How big is the role of communication in MSD projects, and how to select, engage, and motivate market partners in MSD projects?
Just realized I didn't answer all of Adlira's question, because she asked whether MSD training for these officials would actually help. I'm not sure it would, because I think this is more relational. It's about building relationships with people, and maybe some kind of I don't know, of a training of understanding how complex systems change, not with a view on market systems particularly, but with a view on socio-economic systems more broadly. That might work, but I don't think training in them in MSD particularly would make a big difference there. Again, this is more a political or political economy problem, I guess, to tackle rather than an MSD one. To come to the question of communications, I think communications is always crucial. I mean, always when people come together and work together and learn together, they need to talk together and exchange what they do. It starts with the communication of the MSD project with potential partners. It's about sharing intention. It's about overcoming obstacles together. It's about commitment to figure out things together. So in that sense, this kind of communication is, in a way, to see whether a partner works, whether we can work with a particular partners, whether we can get into this trust level of communication. Ideally, the project is not telling the partner what to do, and the partner is just executing, but the project should approach the partner maybe with an idea or a hunch that resonates with the partner's own experiences and the partner's own questions, and then walk the way together with the partner from there. It's a shared problem-solving approach that needs to be adopted by the project and the partner. And probably the situations I know, none of the two actors know the solution to this in the beginning. Neither the project knows exactly what can be done or what should be done, nor the partner knows exactly how to design the solution. So it is about inquiring together and figuring things out together as we go. So in that sense, how do we connect? How do we select partners? How do we work with partners? I would say I'm still very much in favor of something like a self-selection of partners, really working with the partners who have an interest, who are motivated, who want to see change. Maybe partners who have already tried things, already tried to change the situation for the broader sector, not just for themselves, who have a record of trying things that would benefit others as well. If we can find partners like these, that are then willing to step forward and say, okay, I want to give this a chance and I want to work with this project. Let's try something. And that would be the ideal case. If we are in a situation where we have to continuously push the partner forward and say, let's do this, let's come, why don't you try this? It'll be really hard. It will also be really hard then for whatever comes out there to interest other partners in.
And we also have a question from Mitko Pistolov, who is Public Outreach Coordinator at the Education for Employment in North Macedonia project of the SDC. When communicating or public outreach under an MSD project, who sends a message to whom and does it work?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a question that goes back quite a bit in the whole discussion around MSD. It's not a new question, and I don't think there is a right answer. In my particular view, and I'm not a communications expert, just to state that up front, but I'm kind of adhering to the tradition of MSD projects trying to keep a low profile, not to kind of communicate from the project what the project has done. but to allow the stage, to leave the stage for the local actors, for the partners, to own the change and to communicate the change, and to work with others to communicate why they did it and how it worked. So what I'm interested in is how can projects, maybe rather than communicating themselves and putting their own brand in the front, how can they become better in strengthening communications among local actors, both economic actors, but maybe also the media. I know a lot of MSD projects have worked in media, and I think that's a good thing. So maybe we can look at it from a knowledge management or knowledge flow perspective, saying that we want to help strengthen the knowledge flows within an economy between research and development actors, academia, private sector actors, government actors. How do informations flow, and how do people pick up new ideas? How do they work together on solving problems? This, as we heard from as we talked about in the last question, communicating to solve problems together is very important. So asking the question of how can we support as an MSD project these particular communications and information flows, I think is very important. So giving less focus on information flows from the locality to the project, to the donor, and more within local stakeholders. And I'm very excited that Mesopartner is starting to work together with the Helvetas RECONOMY project to look into these questions and how this kind of knowledge management and communications among stakeholders in the different regions that the project works in can be strengthened, rather than to just look at knowledge management as an internal function of the project itself.
In the next episode, we'll talk to Nabanita Sembeckers and Mike Albo, addressing the remainder of your questions on whether the MSD approach works in practice and what it takes to shift to a systemic approach. Please let us know in the comment section whether you agree or disagree with the ideas expressed by our guests. You've been watching and listening to Inclusive Plug with me, Sabine, at RECONOMY, a program of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency implemented by Helvetas in 12 countries in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. Thank you for tuning in, and see you soon.